It was a Saturday morning in June 1993, and the sun had barely crested over the rooftops in the small Ohio town of Beechwood when 6-year-old Joshua Lane padded barefoot across his backyard, dragging his favorite red plastic truck through the dew-kissed grass. His mother, Karen, stood at the kitchen window sipping coffee, watching him with a tired but warm smile. The world felt safe, familiar, ordinary. The Lane backyard was enclosed by a modest wooden fence, shaded by a few tall maples. A worn swing set creaked softly in the breeze, and in the far left corner, a plastic sandbox sat partially covered, a few toy shovels sticking out like forgotten flags. It was the kind of morning when everything felt suspended in gentle stillness. Karen had just turned away to rinse her mug when she realized the stillness had shifted. She blinked. There had been noise just a second ago, the rattle of wheels on dirt, the soft thud of Joshua's steps, his humming. Now, silence. "Josh," she called, peering through the screen door. Nothing. She stepped outside, eyes scanning the yard. The swing swayed slightly, but he wasn't on it. The sandbox was undisturbed. His truck sat abandoned on its side, wheels still spinning. At first she thought he was playing a game, maybe hiding behind the shed or crouching under the porch. But as minutes dragged on, panic bloomed in her chest. She ran barefoot through the yard, calling his name louder each time. There was no answer. She pounded on the neighbors' doors, her voice cracking. Mr. Eckhart next door joined the search, jogging down the street. Another neighbor called 911. Within 20 minutes, police arrived, and the search began. The backyard was roped off. Officers combed the area. Dogs sniffed the perimeter. A helicopter buzzed overhead. No signs of struggle, no broken fence slats, no footprints leading out. Joshua had vanished. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking and mysterious journey, make sure to subscribe. These are the stories that stay with you, the ones that deserve to be told and heard. The media picked up the story quickly. A missing child, gone in broad daylight from a suburban backyard, stirred something primal in everyone. Reporters flocked to the neighborhood. Cameras captured Karen's tear-streaked face as she clutched her son's blue windbreaker to her chest. Mark Lane, Joshua's father, stood beside her in silence during press conferences. But something in his eyes had already begun to dim. He didn't speak much, not to the police, not to Karen. Their shared grief created distance, not closeness. In the first 48 hours, police explored every angle. Was it a kidnapping? A runaway situation? Unlikely. Joshua was 6, barely tall enough to reach the latch on the gate. No signs pointed to a break-in or forced entry. No ransom note arrived. They questioned everyone in the neighborhood. A few people mentioned a white van seen slowly cruising the street earlier that morning, but no one caught the license plate. Another neighbor remembered a man, possibly homeless, sitting on a bench in the park a few days before watching children play. But he was never found again. Flyers were printed and posted across Ohio. Joshua's smiling face appeared on television screens and telephone poles. Karen pleaded on the evening news, voice trembling, begging anyone who might know something to come forward. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Leads dried up. The white van was never located. The man in the park never resurfaced. No one saw anything. No screams were heard. No calls came in. The case grew cold, slowly swallowed by the same quiet stillness that had marked the morning of Joshua's disappearance. Karen refused to move. She told police she couldn't. What if Joshua came back? What if he found his way home and she wasn't there? She left the porch light on every night. She kept his room exactly the same. Dinosaur posters on the wall, Lego towers half-built on the floor, and the red truck he had left behind, now resting on his pillow like a relic. The backyard turned into something sacred and haunted. Karen rarely mowed the lawn anymore. The sandbox collected rainwater and leaves, but she never let anyone disturb it. Something inside her whispered that part of Joshua still lingered there, and she was not ready to let that go. Beechwood moved on. New families moved in. The neighborhood changed, but for Karen Lane, time had stopped in 1993. Every June, she stood in the backyard with a candle, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by old neighbors, and every year she whispered into the wind, "I'm still looking, baby. I'm not done." And neither was the story. The first few days were a storm of urgency and noise. Helicopters thundered overhead, search dogs barked as they sniffed through the woods behind the neighborhood, and dozens of volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, calling Joshua's name. But as the week wore on, the town's energy shifted from frantic action to a hollow, exhausted silence. Karen Lane remained in her backyard, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat. She sat on the porch steps, clutching the red truck Joshua had left behind. Her eyes never left the gate. She barely spoke. She didn't cry anymore. Grief had settled over her like fog, thick, suffocating and directionless. Detectives came and went. They asked the same questions again and again. Was there anyone who might have had a reason to harm Joshua? Did he ever talk about going away? Did he have any hiding spots? Karen answered patiently the first time, then firmly, then with a quiet rage that bubbled behind her words. "No," she told them. "He was 6. He was playing in his yard. Someone took him." The official report labeled it as a possible abduction, but without evidence the case had no shape. Nothing had been broken or forced open. No shoe prints led out of the yard. The police dog had tracked Joshua's scent to the edge of the sandbox, and then it stopped, like he had vanished into thin air. Rumors started circulating almost immediately. A group of teens claimed they saw a man watching the park from his truck a few days before the disappearance. A woman across town swore she'd seen a child, matching Joshua's description, boarding a bus with an older man. The police investigated each tip, but every lead fizzled out, vague or unverifiable. Some neighbors whispered that the family must have known more than they let on. Others speculated that Mark Lane, quiet and distant, hadn't seemed broken enough for a grieving father. It was ugly and unfair, but in the absence of answers, suspicion flourished like weeds. Karen shut out the world. She stopped answering the phone. Reporters continued to call, hoping for updates, hoping for tears on camera. She gave them nothing. Her focus narrowed into a single point: getting Joshua back. She pinned every flyer she could find on the wall of what used to be their guest room. Names and faces of other missing children stared back at her. She read every article. She learned every case. She began seeing patterns, or maybe just clinging to the illusion that patterns existed. One night she wandered the backyard again, unable to sleep. The wind was sharp, the sky moonless. As she passed the swing set, she paused, remembering how Joshua used to shout when she pushed him too high. The memory hurt. It dug into her like glass. She sat in the grass staring at the sandbox when she heard a sound, a single low bark. She looked toward the gate, heart thudding, but the yard was empty. The air was still. The dog next door barked again, then fell silent. Karen stayed outside until dawn. Mark Lane didn't last the year. He moved out in October, leaving behind his wedding ring on the kitchen counter and a note that said simply, "I can't do this anymore." Karen didn't stop him. In her mind, she had already lost her son. Losing her husband didn't register the same way. By the end of 1993, the news cycle had moved on. There were new tragedies, new headlines, other children with their own stories. Joshua's name was still listed in the national database. His face appeared on milk cartons for a while, but people stopped asking. Karen didn't stop. She visited psychics, some of whom offered wild and contradictory visions. She traveled to small towns across the state, chasing tips that turned into dust. She posted messages on internet forums in their infancy, begging for any information. Nothing came. As the first anniversary of Joshua's disappearance approached, Karen began to feel something shift inside her. It wasn't closure. That word made her nauseous. But it was a transition. Her grief began to morph into something else. Obsession. She started a journal. Every day she wrote to Joshua. She described the weather, the neighbors, what she had for dinner. She told him about the flowers blooming, the birds that nested near the fence, the toys he'd left behind. And always at the end she wrote, "I know you're out there. I know you remember me. I'm coming for you." 11 months after he disappeared, a letter arrived at her door. It had no return address. Inside was a single sentence typed in red ink. "He's not where you think." "Don't trust what they told you." Karen stared at the words, her hands trembling. It was the first new clue in almost a year, and it changed everything. Karen held the letter for hours, her fingers tracing the words again and again. "He's not where you think." Don't trust what they told you. No signature, no envelope markings, just a cold statement dropped into her world like a match onto dry leaves. It reignited everything. She drove to the police station the next morning, letter folded neatly in a plastic sleeve. The detective assigned to Joshua's case, a man named Dalton, was cordial but dismissive. "We get these kinds of things all the time," he said, "usually from people seeking attention." Karen leaned across the desk. "But what if it's not?" he sighed. "Then we'd need more. Something verifiable. Right now it's a dead end." Karen left the station with her heart pounding and her mind racing. If they wouldn't investigate, she would. She photocopied the letter, pinned one copy to her bedroom wall, and placed the original in her journal. That night she stared at it until her eyes burned. She began cataloging every detail about the investigation that had never sat right with her. The way the search had ended so quickly, the lack of forensic attention to the yard, the silence about the van sighting, the unexplained end of the dog's scent trail, and the sandbox, always the sandbox. She called a private investigator named Julian Cross. He came recommended by a friend whose niece had gone missing years ago. Julian was in his late 40s, with sharp eyes and a quiet way of asking questions that made people tell the truth without realizing it. He listened as Karen explained everything, from Joshua's last moments to the letter that had arrived without warning. "I need someone who won't give up when the trail goes cold," she said. Julian nodded. "Cold trails don't scare me. You do realize it's been nearly a year?" Karen didn't flinch. "That's why I need you." They started with the police report. Julian filed a Freedom of Information request and uncovered details that hadn't been shared with Karen. Inconsistent witness testimonies, a dismissed tip from a truck driver, and a strange note in the margin. "Shed locked, no key found." Karen blinked when she read that. "We didn't even own a lock for the shed." They went to the backyard together. Karen hadn't been back there with anyone else since the day the search ended. The grass was high. The swing set was rusting. The sandbox had collapsed slightly on one side from years of rain and neglect. Julian walked slowly, taking in everything. He knelt by the sandbox and tapped the edge. This was never excavated. Karen shook her head. They brought dogs, but they never dug. Said there was no reason. He didn't respond. He walked to the shed, tried the door, it creaked open. Inside were old gardening tools, broken chairs, and dust. Nothing strange, and no signs it had ever been locked. Back in the house, Julian asked about Joshua's room. Karen led him upstairs. The space was perfectly preserved. Dinosaur wallpaper, crayon drawings, the red truck on the shelf. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the toy box at the foot of the bed. Karen hesitated. "Of course." He lifted the lid. Inside were faded, stuffed animals, a few puzzles, a flashlight, and a worn blanket. He shifted the contents gently, then stopped. "This box is heavy. You said you hadn't touched anything in here since he disappeared." "Not once." He tapped the base. "Could be reinforced." "Maybe something under it." Karen's breath caught. "You think something was hidden?" "Maybe or maybe not, but it's worth checking." He closed the lid and looked at her. "Are you ready for what we might find?" Karen stared at the toy box. So many nights she'd sat beside it, too afraid to open it, as if breaking that sacred stillness might erase the last thread of connection to her son. But now she wanted answers more than memories. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "We'll look tomorrow." That night, she dreamed of Joshua for the first time in months. He stood at the edge of the sandbox, looking over his shoulder, his mouth moving soundlessly. She ran toward him, but the ground pulled her back like sand swallowing her feet. She screamed, but no sound came out. He turned, stepped into the box, and vanished. She woke up drenched in sweat. The house was silent. But in that silence, a thought echoed. "He's not where you think." She sat in the dark, staring at the hallway outside Joshua's room, knowing that something was waiting. Maybe beneath their feet, maybe in the past, but close. Closer than anyone had ever realized. Karen didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of Joshua's room until dawn, her back against the wall, eyes fixed on the toy box. When the morning sun finally seeped through the blinds, she stood, stretched her stiff limbs, and went downstairs to call Julian. He arrived within the hour, carrying a small toolkit. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. He cleared the box's contents carefully, set them aside, and examined the base. He rapped his knuckles on the wood, listening. "Hollow," he muttered. "Definitely something under here." Karen watched, arms crossed tightly, heart pounding as he unscrewed the bottom panel. It came off cleanly, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside there was nothing but dust and a small jagged piece of torn fabric, pale blue with what looked like tiny stars stitched into it. Karen gasped. That was his pajama top. He wore it the night before. Julian picked it up with gloved fingers, inspecting it. Torn, he noted. But this was hidden, not lost. Karen's throat tightened. Why would it be under the toy box? How did it get there? He didn't answer. He opened a second pouch on his kit and pulled out a small ultraviolet flashlight. He scanned the interior of the compartment. Nothing at first. Then a faint smear lit up along one corner. Julian exhaled slowly. Could be old blood. Karen's knees buckled slightly, and she caught the bedpost to stay upright. Julian stood and faced her. "I'm going to run tests, but this is something. It's more than they ever looked for." Later that day, they revisited the backyard. Julian moved slowly, systematically. At the edge of the sandbox, he knelt again, brushing away loose soil with his hand. "The dog lost the scent here," he said quietly. "And you said this corner always bothered you?" Karen nodded. Something felt wrong there. Like the earth was different. Julian retrieved a small probe rod and pushed it into the soil at various points. At one spot, near the far edge, it met unexpected resistance. He cleared a patch of dirt and tapped the surface beneath. Hardwood. Could be a board. Might be covering something. They brought out shovels. Karen didn't hesitate this time. She dug with her bare hands, pulling up grass, gravel, and dirt. Within minutes, they revealed a wooden panel, weathered but intact. Julian pried it up. Beneath it was darkness, a narrow hole descending into the earth. The smell was musty, stale. Karen recoiled slightly. "Looks like a crawl space," Julian said, "but it shouldn't be here." "This isn't part of the house's structure." Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "What is it then?" Julian lowered a small camera attached to a cable. They watched the live feed on his screen. The camera revealed a shallow underground space with walls supported by old timber beams, and then drawings, faded, childish scribbles in crayon, scrawled across a wood panel. A red sun. A blue stick figure. A house. And one, faint but clear. Josh, age 6. Karen's breath caught. That's his handwriting. Julian didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Someone was down there. Someone small, and recently enough for this to still be legible." Karen covered her mouth, her thoughts spinning. This changed everything. Joshua hadn't simply vanished into thin air. He had been taken and hidden, right under their feet. Julian sat back on his heels, his expression unreadable. "We need to call the police." Karen hesitated. "They'll shut it all down again. They'll lock me out." "You found this on your own," Julian said gently. "They can't ignore it now." Reluctantly, she agreed. The officers arrived within the hour. Crime scene tape went up. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. A forensics team descended into the crawl space, collecting samples and photographing everything. Karen was asked to wait inside. She sat by the window, watching them work. A young officer came to ask routine questions, and she answered automatically. But her mind stayed locked on that image, the name scrawled in crayon, the childish son. Later, Detective Dalton reappeared. He looked tired, older than she remembered. He spoke carefully, like someone handling glass. "We're treating this as a possible crime scene connected to Joshua's disappearance," he said. "We'll need to keep the yard secured." Karen nodded, her voice low. "Whatever it takes." That night, the backyard was silent again, but this time, there was movement. Something had shifted. For the first time in 11 years, Karen felt like she wasn't just grieving, she was searching, and the search had finally begun to answer. Time passed, slow and heavy, like the air inside the Lane house. The crawlspace remained sealed, guarded by police tape and under forensic examination for days. Investigators came and went. Karen watched them from her porch with guarded eyes. They gave no updates, she didn't ask. Then, just as suddenly as they'd arrived, they were gone. The tape came down. The yard was returned to her with no answers, and so life continued. Somehow. 11 years. Karen Lane was now 43. Her hair had grayed around the edges. Fine lines creased the corners of her eyes. She lived alone in the same house in the same neighborhood that had changed around her. New families came and went. Children's laughter returned to the park. But in Karen's home, time remained anchored to 1993. She no longer kept up the illusion of normalcy. Joshua's room stayed exactly as it was, not out of ritual anymore, but out of resignation, a monument to the past. A space untouched by the world. June arrived again, the month she dreaded, the month her son had disappeared. On the anniversary, she did what she always did, lit a single candle, placed it at the foot of the sandbox, and whispered into the breeze. But that night, something stirred in her, a whisper of instinct, a quiet urging she couldn't explain. She walked back inside, climbed the stairs to Joshua's room, and sat on his bed for the first time in years. The red truck still sat on the shelf. The toy box stood at the foot of the bed, empty now, but somehow heavier in her mind than it had ever been. Her eyes rested on it, unmoving. She stood, stepped toward it, and opened the lid. It creaked softly. Inside, only dust remained, and one item she hadn't noticed before, a small hard object beneath the lining. She reached in and pulled out an old handheld voice recorder, the kind with tiny cassette tapes inside. It was worn, scratched, and covered in grime. Her hands trembled. How had they missed this? She pressed play. For several seconds, nothing but static. Then, a sound. A faint, breathy whisper, words buried in the hiss. She turned the volume up. The static cleared slightly, and she heard it again, just loud enough to recognize. "Mom, it's cold here." Karen dropped the recorder. Her body went numb. She stared at the device on the floor, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. The voice had been soft, fragile, but unmistakable. Joshua. She scrambled to pick it up again, rewound it, played it back. The same whisper, the same sentence. Her heart thundered in her chest. She listened again and again. "Mom, it's cold here." Tears streamed down her face. This wasn't imagined. It wasn't a memory, it was real. She sat on the bed, clutching the recorder to her chest, rocking slowly. Her thoughts raced. Who recorded this? When? Why was it hidden in the toy box? And how had no one found it before? She couldn't stay still. She took the recorder downstairs, placed it on the kitchen table, and stared at it under the overhead light. The tape inside was worn, likely over a decade old. She'd need help analyzing it, someone who could determine when it was made, if anything had been altered. There was only one person she trusted. Julian. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. She didn't explain, just said, "Come over, now." He arrived within the hour, took one look at her face, and said nothing. She handed him the recorder. He examined it silently, tested it, rewound the tape, listened. When the whisper played, his eyes narrowed. He pressed stop. "That's a child's voice." Karen nodded, lips trembling. "It's him." He didn't argue, he didn't try to soften it. "Where did you find this?" "In the toy box, beneath the lining. I didn't see it before." Julian sat back, deep in thought. Someone left it there, after the box was emptied. They wanted it to be found, but not too soon. "Why now?" she asked. I don't know, he said, but this changes things. She clutched the table edge. Julian, if that's Joshua, if he recorded that, does that mean he was alive after... He looked at her. We need to find out when that recording was made. Karen nodded slowly. Her fingers tightened around the recorder. For the first time in years, she wasn't simply mourning. She wasn't just remembering, she was listening, and her son had spoken. Julian sat with the recorder in his lap, turning it over slowly as if it might reveal more by touch alone. It's an older model, late 80s, maybe early 90s, he said. No way to track where it came from, unless we find a serial number. But the tape could hold clues. Karen leaned forward. What kind of clues? Background noise, electrical patterns, even the quality of the hiss. There are experts who can date these things within a reasonable range. He paused, then added, if he was still alive when this was recorded, we need to know when it was. Karen's voice cracked. It sounded recent. Julian didn't respond. He knew better than to offer comfort until he had facts. He took the recorder with him, promising to have it analyzed by a sound engineer he trusted. Karen watched him drive away, clutching her arms tightly. That night, the memory of the whisper haunted her. Mom, it's cold here. The voice echoed in the stillness of the house, as if it were coming from the walls, from beneath the floor. The next morning, Julian returned. His eyes were tired, but his voice was steady. The tapes degraded, but they were able to narrow down the recording date to somewhere between 1999 and 2003. Karen's heart stopped. That's at least 6 years after he disappeared. Julian nodded, which means someone kept him alive. Somewhere. Karen covered her mouth, trying to breathe through the shock. Her mind reeled. All those years, every sleepless night, every prayer, and he had still been alive. We need to look beneath this house, she said suddenly. Julian blinked. We already found the crawl space. No, I mean more. The foundation. Every inch. Something's down there. Julian hesitated. You want to tear up your floor? I want to know where he was when he said it was cold. They went to the basement, which Karen rarely entered. It was unfinished. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, old paint cans stacked in a corner. Julian began tapping along the walls with a rubber mallet, listening for changes in tone. About halfway along the eastern wall, he stopped. This section sounds off. He cleared the area and spotted faint lines in the concrete, like someone had patched a square section. It's newer. Karen felt the hairs on her neck rise. Can we open it? I'll need tools and time, she nodded. Take both. The next day, Julian returned with equipment. Karen watched as he carefully chipped away at the wall. Beneath the top layer of cement, he found bricks, old, damp, and crumbling. Behind those bricks, a dark void opened. Karen stepped back. Julian lowered a flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a narrow tunnel, rough walls, dirt floor. The smell that rose from within was rank, a mix of mildew, rot, and something metallic. He slipped on gloves and crawled in. Karen waited, heart racing. Minutes passed. Finally, he returned, his face pale. There's a room, he said, hidden under your house. A room, she echoed. Wooden walls, a child's mattress, toys. Drawings on the planks. He was down there, Karen, for years maybe. Her legs gave out and she sank onto the steps. Why didn't we know? Why didn't anyone check? Julian sat beside her. Because no one thought to look this deep, or maybe someone didn't want them to. They called the police again. This time the response was different. The hidden room was real, tangible. Officers in hazmat suits documented every inch. A crime scene technician said it looked like it had been lived in for a long time, then abruptly abandoned. Karen was brought in for questioning, not as a suspect, but as a central figure. She answered everything honestly, recounting the letter, the voice recorder, the discovery of the hidden space. The detectives said little in return. She saw the way they looked at her, not with suspicion but with something closer to dread, as if they realized how many layers of failure this case had uncovered. Julian stayed close. He kept notes. He recorded everything they were told. Late that night, As they stood in the kitchen, he looked at Karen and said, "This wasn't just someone hiding him. Someone built that space, designed it, used it." Karen felt something tighten in her chest. "You think it was more than just one person?" Julian didn't answer, but in his silence the implication hung in the air. There was still more hidden beneath the surface, and they had only just begun to uncover it. They called it a subterranean containment space in the official reports, but to Karen it was a prison. The hidden room beneath her house was no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were made of thin plywood, insulated with old blankets and newspapers. One corner held a cot-sized mattress, now rotted through. There were plastic plates, a flashlight long since dead, and dozens of drawings in crayon scattered along the walls and floor. Each picture felt like a punch to the chest. A red truck, a woman with yellow hair, a son with a face, and one darker than the rest showed a figure with no face standing by a staircase. On one wall, scribbled over and over in shaky, uneven letters, "Don't forget, don't forget." Karen stood outside the space while investigators worked. They wouldn't let her go inside, but they let her look. She saw enough. Julian photographed everything he could. He also asked the questions no one else did. Who would have built this? When? And why underneath this house? The answer came from a city permit archive Julian requested, a detail missed by police. In 1986, before the Lanes had moved in, the previous owner had hired a contractor for foundation reinforcement and sub-level storage. The contractor's name was Edward Lobb. Karen didn't recognize it. Julian's expression darkened. Lobb lived 3 streets over, retired now, did work on several houses in this neighborhood, including yours. Karen swallowed hard. So, he had access. And he knew how to build something like this without drawing attention. Julian began digging into Edward Lobb's history. Public records showed that he had died in 1999, found in his home from a heart attack. No criminal record, no complaints. But when Julian mapped all his contracting jobs, a chilling pattern emerged. 6 homes, all within a 3-mile radius, all with histories of children reported missing between 1985 and 2003. Karen felt her stomach turn. He was selecting houses. Julian nodded. He wasn't kidnapping them from the outside. He was preparing places to keep them, maybe even before they were taken. One of the homes had since been demolished. Another was still standing and belonged to a woman whose son disappeared in 1997. Julian reached out to her. She didn't want to talk at first, but when he showed her the drawings from Karen's crawlspace, she broke down. Her son's name was Luke. He vanished from their backyard just like Joshua. She'd always believed he'd been taken by someone local, but no one ever listened. Julian returned with her testimony and gave it to the police. They reopened her son's case the next day. Karen sat at the dining table, papers spread before her, her fingers shaking as she traced the names of the other missing children. The pattern was undeniable now. Lobb hadn't acted randomly. He had worked under the radar, building hidden spaces, possibly more elaborate ones, in homes that seemed ordinary. He blended in. He was trusted. The pieces were falling into place, but the center was still missing. Why? Julian requested permission to re-examine Lobb's property, now owned by a young couple. With their consent, he and a small forensic team searched the basement. There, behind an old water heater, they found a sealed freezer bolted shut and embedded in concrete. The police were called. They broke it open. Inside were items wrapped in plastic, children's shoes, toys, a stuffed animal, a lock of hair, and a single faded Polaroid photograph showing a boy who looked like Joshua, sitting cross-legged in a corner, eyes vacant. Karen clutched the photo, tears spilling freely. That's him. That's Joshua. The room went silent. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't look away. Her baby had been there. The walls of that freezer, cold and quiet, had held the echo of her son's life. Julian pressed gently. It means he survived. For some time. Karen nodded, barely. But where did he go? That question hovered. In the report, the photo was labeled as Recovered Item 14. It became evidence. But to Karen, it was everything. Julian wasn't done. He reviewed every property Lob had worked on. He found signs of sealed panels, false walls, unfinished basements. Each one a possibility. Karen understood now it wasn't just about Joshua. It never had been. There were others, other children, other mothers waiting in silence. And something told her. This was far from over. In the days that followed the discovery at Edward Lob's former home, the investigation shifted from passive review to active pursuit. The FBI took over, pulling files from local departments, re-examining missing children cases with renewed urgency. Karen, once a grieving mother on the sidelines, was now at the center of something much larger than she'd ever imagined. They analyzed the photo found in the freezer, the boy's posture, the background, the shadows. A forensic expert estimated it was taken around the year 2000, based on the film type and degradation. That meant Joshua had been alive for at least 7 years after his disappearance, and yet no remains had ever been found. No body, no confirmed evidence of death, just echoes. DNA tests on the items in the freezer confirmed multiple profiles. Joshua's was one of them. But there was another, an unknown male, not Lob. That detail unsettled Julian more than anything else. This wasn't just one man, he said, his voice grim. Lob may have built the spaces, but someone else kept them occupied. Someone who's still out there. Karen stared at the evidence photos spread across her table. So many children, so many timelines. The connections were no longer theoretical. They were factual. Julian dug deeper into Lob's contracts, uncovering old business receipts and unfiled permits. One particular name showed up repeatedly, a subcontractor named Neil Cray, who worked with Lob for over a decade. No criminal history, no traceable address in recent years. Karen felt a chill when she saw his picture. A blank stare, sunken cheeks, the kind of face you forget. And that's what made him dangerous. They submitted his name to the FBI. A background check confirmed that Neil had dropped off the grid in 2002, around the same time the crawl space beneath Karen's home showed signs of being sealed. Coincidence, they said. But Julian didn't believe in those anymore. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. There had been a system, a method, an organized hidden network designed not just to take children, but to contain them, and it had been operating under everyone's noses. Karen couldn't sleep. She sat up late reading old case files, studying the patterns. Boys between 5 and 8. Always from quiet neighborhoods, always snatched without a sound. And in each case, a house Lob had worked on was within walking distance. The worst realization wasn't that her son had been held captive. It was that he might not have been the only one, and they might never have known, if not for the voice on the recorder. One afternoon, Julian came to her with an expression she'd come to dread, the one he wore when he had something painful to share. "The tunnels," he said. "They go beyond your house." Karen blinked. "What do you mean?" "The crawl space under your home. It's connected to a larger system. We found a sealed passage leading under the street. We've traced it to at least 2 other basements nearby. One of them leads to an abandoned property on Glade Avenue." Karen's stomach turned. That house had been empty since she could remember. She'd passed it hundreds of times. She never knew. Julian continued. "That house has another hidden room, smaller, fresher, like it was in use more recently." She closed her eyes. "You think Joshua was moved?" Julian nodded. "We believe he may have escaped or been let go, but there's no way he made it far without help." Karen's thoughts spiraled. What if he was still out there, not dead, not lost, just forgotten? The FBI found more drawings in the Glade Avenue basement. One showed a child holding a flashlight, reaching toward a ladder. Another showed a gate. And on the wall, scribbled in red crayon, "I saw the moon again." Karen's heart ached. That had been their secret phrase. She used to tell Joshua, "When it gets scary, look for the moon. It means I'm still with you." It was him. He had been there. Julian stared at the wall, then turned to Karen. He was trying to get out. She nodded slowly. And maybe he did. That night, Karen sat with the recorder again, played the voice, closed her eyes, listened. "Mom, "It's cold here." He had called out, not just in fear, but in hope. Hope that she was still listening, and she was. Karen Lane no longer waited for answers. She demanded them. In the months following the discovery of the tunnels and drawings, she transformed her grief into purpose. She founded an organization called Voices Beneath, focused on investigating forgotten child disappearance cases and promoting underground search efforts in abandoned or compromised homes. She poured her savings into the effort. She hosted meetings, distributed leaflets, funded private searches. Survivors and grieving families began to reach out. Her home became a hub, not of mourning, but of movement. Julian remained by her side. Together, they filed requests for old property plans, interviewed retired police officers, and revisited parents who had long given up hope. Some looked at Karen with pity. Others with something closer to awe. It was in the midst of this storm that a tip came in. A man in Cincinnati claimed he had seen a young homeless person with a deep scar on his left wrist and a large birthmark behind his ear. He said the kid looked lost but sharp and had once asked if anyone remembered the Lane boy. Karen froze. Joshua had a crescent-shaped birthmark behind his right ear. And when he was 5, he fell and broke his wrist. It had healed but left a faint scar. Julian made calls. The man had no photo but said the boy sometimes hung around near a shelter under the I-71 overpass. He'd heard him hum something strange, a melody that didn't match any popular tune. Karen went pale. "I used to sing Joshua a lullaby I made up." No one else would know it. Within hours, she and Julian were in the car, speeding toward Cincinnati. The drive was long and heavy with silence. Karen stared out the window, lost in memory and fear. She had pictured this moment 1,000 times and never once knew how to prepare. They reached the overpass at dusk. The shelter volunteers hadn't seen the boy in 2 days, but they gave Karen a description. Slight frame, wary eyes, dirty clothes, always alone. She searched until her legs ached. She approached anyone who remotely resembled him, heart leaping, then sinking, until she saw a boy, maybe 17, maybe older, sitting near a dumpster, drawing in the dirt with a stick. He looked up when she neared. His eyes were a storm of brown and grey, his hair long, matted, his face thin. Karen's breath caught. "Joshua," she whispered. The boy tensed, said nothing. She crouched, voice trembling. "Do you remember the red truck, the sandbox, the moon?" His eyes flickered. Something passed across his face, confusion, fear, maybe recognition. He stood abruptly and turned away. "Wait," she cried, stepping forward. "Please." He froze. Then softly he began to hum. The melody was off-key, quiet, but unmistakable. Karen dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's you," she whispered. "It's you." Julian approached slowly. The boy turned back, eyes glassy. "Who are you?" he asked, voice raw, uncertain. Karen couldn't speak. She simply reached out her hand. "I'm your mother." The boy didn't take it. He just stared. Then finally, "I don't remember you, but I feel like I should." She nodded. "That's okay. We have time." They didn't push. Julian arranged for a motel room, food, clean clothes. The boy, who now went by Jay, allowed himself to be helped, but always kept a physical distance. Karen understood. He had been somewhere dark. She would not drag him into the light. She would wait until he stepped forward on his own. The next morning, a DNA sample was collected. The weight was unbearable. Karen didn't sleep. She paced the motel floor, replaying every second of the meeting, every glance, every word. She feared hope as much as she clung to it. Finally, the call came. Julian answered. He listened silently, then turned to her with tears in his eyes. 99.7% match, he said. "It's him." Karen sat down slowly, as if her body couldn't hold the weight of the moment. Her son was alive. She didn't cry, not yet. The grief hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer about what she had lost. It was about what she might rebuild. Outside, Jay sat on a bench staring at the sky. When Karen stepped beside him, he didn't flinch. "Do you like the stars?" she asked. He shrugged. "I think I used to." She sat beside him, close but not too close. "There's a lot we used to do. We can take our time remembering." He looked at her then, for a long moment, and she saw it, the flicker, the glint, a thread stretching between them. He didn't speak, but he didn't walk away, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were delicate, like walking on glass. Karen didn't push. Joshua, still called himself that, still recoiled from the word mom like it was a sound he didn't trust. But he stayed. He listened. And sometimes, when the world around him quieted, he looked at her like he was trying to remember something buried deep. Karen enrolled him in therapy with a specialist who dealt with long-term trauma and identity loss. Sessions were slow, sometimes silent, sometimes filled with tears. He didn't speak much about where he'd been, only said once, "It was always cold and quiet." Like the world forgot me. Karen didn't ask for more, she waited. He refused to return to the house in Beechwood, so Karen sold it. She didn't even go back to pack. She left everything behind, except the red truck and the voice recorder. Those she kept in a small wooden box beside her bed in their new apartment 2 towns over. She started over with him, cooked simple meals, showed him photo albums, played music he used to like. They sat on the floor and built puzzles. Some nights he would stare at the pieces for hours and then suddenly say something like, "I had a blanket with stars," or "You used to make grilled cheese with crusts cut off." Each time she smiled. "Yes," she'd say, "you remember." Bit by bit he did. He had trouble sleeping. Nightmares came often. He'd wake up in a sweat, eyes wide, fists clenched. Karen would wait by his door until the fear faded. She never entered unless invited. Then one morning, he handed her a drawing. A red truck, a house with 2 windows, a woman and a boy holding hands. He didn't say anything, she framed it. Julian visited often. He didn't speak of the investigation much anymore. Most of the suspects were either dead or missing. The tunnels had been filled, the properties searched. The FBI issued quiet statements and closed most of the reopened cases without public announcements. But Julian kept the files. "For the record," he said, "truth matters even if no one wants to hear it." Karen agreed. She turned Voices Beneath into a national foundation. She spoke at events, shared her story, and each time she ended the same way. "Listen to your instincts. If you feel something's wrong, search, keep searching, even when no one else will." One rainy Thursday, Joshua called her Mom. It was quiet, casual, as if he didn't realize he'd said it. She didn't mention it, just smiled and folded laundry, heart thundering. A week later, he asked if they could visit the park. They walked quietly down the path. He stopped near a swing set and looked around like measuring something invisible. "This feels familiar," he said. She nodded. "It should." He sat on the swing, pushed himself slowly. "I thought I was gone," he whispered. "I thought nobody even remembered me." Karen's throat tightened. She knelt beside him. "I never stopped looking." He looked at her, and this time there was no doubt. Recognition bloomed in his eyes. He reached out, awkwardly, hesitantly, and touched her hand. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, alive. Later that night, as she tucked the red truck into the wooden box beside her bed, she felt peace for the first time in 11 years. She had found him. Not just his body, not just a trace. She had found her son, and he had found his way back. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep in your heart, we invite you to subscribe. These stories are more than mystery. They're about memory, resilience, and the love that never gives up. And if you want to hear another incredible story, click the video now appearing on your screen. About the girl who woke up from a coma speaking a language she never knew, remembering a life she never lived. Because sometimes truth is stranger and more powerful than fiction.